President Moon Jae-in won the support of the world leaders gathered at the UN General Assembly last week for stern international action against North Korea. Following Pyongyang's sixth nuclear test, the UN Security Council quickly adopted Resolution 2375. Washington also announced a set of unilateral sanctions. But the question remains as to whether these sanctions can actually deter a defiant North Korea. And that's the topic we're exploring on this week's Upfront.
World leaders strongly condemned the actions of North Korea at the 72nd session of the UN General Assembly, which took place amid heightened tensions over the regime's continued provocations.
But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. We must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior.
U.S. President Donald Trump delivered a stark warning to the regime, while South Korean President Moon Jae-in called on the international community to sternly respond until North Korea gives up its nuclear ambitions.
모든 나라들이 안보리 결의를 철저하게 이행하고 북한이 추가 도발하면 상응하는 새로운 조치를 모색해야 합니다.
During a trilateral summit, the leaders of South Korea, U.S., and Japan promised to push North Korea with the strongest possible sanctions and pressure to force the regime back to the table for talks. On September 11th, only 9 days after the North's sixth nuclear test, the UN Security Council passed a new sanctions resolution, which included a 30% reduction of oil provided to North Korea, as well as a ban on the export of textiles. However, others questioned the effectiveness, citing the resolution was watered down from Washington's draft, which included a complete ban on oil imports and freeze on the international assets held by leader Kim Jong-un. In addition, North Korea launched another ballistic missile only 3 days after the UN Security Council adopted its latest resolution, further fueling the debate over whether sanctions are an effective deterrent. North Korea continues to be defiant despite strong international warnings. On this week's Upfront, we examine the implementation of the latest economic sanctions imposed on Pyongyang by the UN and discuss its effectiveness.
For today's discussion, we're joined by two experts. Oh Joon, a former ambassador to the UN and a current professor at Kyung Hee University. And Kim Young-joon, partner at Milbank, who visited North Korea in 2011 as part of a small group of U.S. civilian opinion leaders at the invitation of the North's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm sure you've heard President Moon's keynote speech at the UN General Assembly last week. He welcomed the UNSC resolution and expressed his support for international sanctions and pressure. But in terms of methodology, he made it clear that he would pursue peaceful and diplomatic solutions. What were your thoughts upon hearing his speech?
Well, actually, these sanctions and pressure, they are part of the efforts to reach a peaceful solution to this issue. The opposite of sanctions and pressure should be using force. So I think what we are doing in the UN and in the international community currently is part of diplomatic solutions. And I think President Moon is right to support it.
What do you think, Mr. Kim?
Yes, sanctions, as the ambassador said, sanctions' ultimate purpose is to bring people to the table by exerting pressure on them. And enough international players have made hostile words toward North Korea, so there's really no point for President Moon to repeat that. So the point was to remind people, while agreeing to the sanctions and sanctions' desirability, it is important to remember, ultimately, you have to have diplomacy in mind. So in that sense, he made the right balance.
Well, President Moon's speech was definitely in stark contrast to U.S. President Donald Trump's speech.
Well, President Trump's speech is in stark contrast with many other people, so that really shouldn't be the benchmark in my view. If you also read between the lines of U.S. administration, like Secretary Mattis and others, they are emphasizing diplomacy over and over again in between President Trump's strong remarks, so we have to keep that in mind.
But what President Trump was saying was, I think, that the U.S. would also prefer a diplomatic solution, but if they cannot go for that, there are other options, including military options.
Yes, he keeps reminding us. Well, the latest UN sanctions are being met with mixed response. Yes, they are the strongest to date, that's for sure, but are they strong enough to rein in North Korea is what a lot of people are asking. What are your thoughts?
At this stage, I think we are not racing against time, meaning North Korea either already has nuclear capability or very close to it. So what matters right now, it seems to me, that we wait until North Korea stops testing. No countries in the world have continued to test missiles and nuclear bombs indefinitely. Missiles and bombs are very expensive. They don't blow them up for no reason. So North Korea will definitely stop, and I think they are very close to it. And then they will turn around and they will go for example, economic development. Then I think we should make sure that they will have to make a choice. The sanctions should be strong enough so that they cannot go for economic development under these sanctions. So they will have to make a choice.
When will they stop, though, once they've mastered the technology?
I think they are very close to it. Yeah. They might not need any more nuclear bomb tests, even if they might go for a few more missile tests.
In the sense that the original U.S. proposed draft was rejected by China and Russia, basically. And the constraint is, from China's perspective in particular, if you go all out in terms of strength of sanctions, people can generally expect what the consequences are, and China is not ready to live with that. And I think the United States basically bought that argument. This is a sort of a simple analogy. You can starve financial resources from a private company, and then company can go bankrupt, and literally the company can cease to exist, can be removed. Unlike the countries, you can starve them of financial resources and really almost physically destroy the countries, but it just cannot be removed. That is the problem. That's, Iraq and Afghanistan are two examples of those basically destroyed countries, but just cannot be removed. So unless the parties who are exerting forces or sanctions are ready to live with the consequences or have some sort of plan, it's hard to take that final step of really going all out in terms of strength of sanctions. That is a limitation on sanctions.
Yeah, the one part that China was very strongly against was the full oil embargo on Pyongyang proposed by the U.S. Many experts also claim that international sanctions won't be effective unless they include shutting down China's oil pipelines to North Korea. But I guess China is unwilling to choke North Korea to that extent.
Yeah,
not yet, anyway.
Yeah, that is basically the point I was getting at. People know exactly, or at least roughly, the consequences, and China and indirectly the United States also are aware of the consequences. So, in a way, parties are not ready to push that button all the way, because the consequences could be very severe, very drastic, quite immediate. But it will not still eliminate the problem. So, unless there's an international consensus how to deal with that problem, I guess parties are not willing to push that final button of just complete embargo of oil, which will literally destabilize the country quite significantly.
Right. The consequences being collapse of the regime and millions of refugees crossing the border into China.
And besides, UN sanctions are not usually designed to undermine ordinary people's livelihood. They are designed to, for example, cut off certain countries' economic activities with the outside world, which is the case in North Korea.
Right, cutting off cash flows, right.
So that means that, these sanctions will take kind of a cumulative effect. So it takes time. That's why it takes time.
Yes, have things changed in North Korea as a result of the latest UN sanctions? Some say there are long lines forming at gas stations. Others say not really. Well, right now we have on the line Voice of America's White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman to tell us what he knows. Steve, we're getting conflicting reports on what's actually happening inside North Korea at the moment under these tougher international sanctions. What can you tell us, especially regarding fuel prices?
Yes, there's been no significant immediate change from what we can tell. We're relying on what diplomats going out to the gasoline stations and driving on the streets are seeing and hearing. And what we do know is that if you look at things since the beginning of the year, yes, there has been a significant increase in fuel prices. And when it comes to diesel, it's up 238% since the beginning of the year until now. And for regular gas, 305%. Now, this is what a diplomat would have to pay, these higher prices, who's going to the pumps in Pyongyang. But we know that in North Korea, there's a coupon system. And so those who are officials and others who have the connections are going to be paying something with the coupons subsidized and such. And that also appears to be what's been going on with the exchange rate, that it seems to be holding stable. And of course, the government can really control it because North Korea is not an open trading system like most of the world. So at least initially, we're not seeing a huge change, but that could change perhaps in the days and weeks to come.
Now, on top of the UNSC resolution, Washington announced a set of unilateral sanctions against North Korea as well. Does Washington think the UN sanctions alone are not enough?
Well, what officials are saying privately and also somewhat on the record is sanctions really are not going to stop or reverse the program, but they hope that Pyongyang will take them seriously, will think twice about any further provocations, because things could even be ratcheted up more. And as has been pointed out by many, many analysts, the sanctions so far have not caused North Korea to raise its hands in surrender and stop the program. And I think there's considerable skepticism that this latest round of sanctions will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But others would say, well, it's better to be ratcheting up sanctions than taking military action, for example.
Steve Herman from Voice of America, thanks for speaking with us today. It's really difficult to know what's happening inside North Korea because it's such a reclusive and isolated nation. So it's no wonder that we are getting conflicting reports. But there are even claims that the North Korean economy has been doing better in recent years under these sanctions.
One thing we know for sure is that North Korea is one of the few countries in the world that is least dependent on trade, least dependent on economic activities with outside world. That means North Korea's GDP will go up even if we cut off all its external economic activities. They can produce more clothes and sneakers, then GDP will go up. But people on the street of Pyongyang, they don't want more clothes and sneakers. They want to have cell phones and color televisions. So that's what I'm saying about waiting out North Korea, waiting until North Korea turns around. And they will go for economic development. Then these sanctions will make a lot of difference.
But don't we need China to come on board? Because most of North Korea's trade is with China.
That's probably why you just mentioned U.S. unilateral sanctions, secondary sanctions. That's why these sanctions are important. In the UN sanctions, countries, each country will make decision on whether they are, for example, companies have violated UN sanctions. But in the case of US unilateral sanctions, it's going to be the US authorities that will make decision whether certain companies in other countries have violated UN sanctions. Then they will apply the same sanctions to that company. So there is difference in terms of who's calling the shots.
Now, Mr. Kim, you've been to North Korea before. What do you think might be happening in North Korea at the moment?
A couple of sort of personal observations during my few days there. You look out from this high-rise hotel at the sunset. It was in May. And then it's in Pyongyang, but you see basically complete pitch dark other than spotlights on major monuments. And we're talking about even high-rise apartments, just pitch dark, not even like flickering lights coming out of the window. So that is pretty striking. Yeah, this is just striking. If Pyongyang is like that, the rest of the country, you can imagine. That was 2011. And another thing, after the dinner, a bunch of us were taken to a pub because they were really into beer those days. And on the way there, there's no traffic light, no street light, and no building light to actually, for the driver to identify, even though they're going there regularly. At night, it's really pitch dark in the middle of Pyongyang. And once we got to the building was completely dark, and then you honk for a few minutes, and then the lights come on and people come out. And so literally people were sitting in this kind of room in the dark, waiting for customers to come. And when the customers come, you turn on the lights, meaning you turn the lights only when absolutely necessary. And I've observed that in many other places, because we went outside Pyongyang as well. So the imagery of people sitting in the dark, I just cannot imagine that happening in any other country. Going back to the sanctions, how North Korea is different from some of the other sanctioned countries, as Ambassador correctly pointed out, Iran sanctions somewhat worked because they were so dependent on export of oil. That's one. Cuba, if Cuba was next to Soviet Union, it'd be very different. But Cuba is completely isolated. It's literally an island country. That's why after 60 years, Cuba has almost become insignificant, irrelevant to the rest of the world, completely isolated. Of course, what that means for the Cubans is complete misery economically and politically for 60 years, but it's been completely isolated. But North Korea is not an island. It's right next to China and Russia. And there are many loopholes in terms of complying with sanctions. For example, only out of 198 UN members, only about barely over 100 countries file what's required in terms of compliance reports. And so you can imagine there's so many loopholes, even though rhetoric is there. That's why sanctions are important symbolically, so you need to impose them, but you shouldn't have really high expectation as to immediate results, resulting in things like price hike on oil. I don't think that has much to do with recent sanctions, for example.
What about, there was one measure in Washington's unilateral sanctions that is similar to the 2005 blacklisting of Banco Delta Asia in Macau, which effectively froze North Korean funds in the amount of something like $25 million. Would that work?
It's very interesting, and people need to understand that was really not a sanction. BDA is a very unique case. There's a USA Patriot Act of 2001, right after 9/11. So it was really designed to ferret out terrorist financing around the world. So there's Section 311 of USA Patriot Act gives the Treasury Department of U.S. tools to designate certain institutions as money launderer.
Evil.
Money launderer, basically. It's because Treasury Department regulation has to do with the integrity of the U.S. financial system. So that was the pretext for imposing this very targeted BDA because they chose BDA because it is not a big bank. It is in Macau. It's not in China. Very limited but concentrated amount of illegal activity of money laundering, supernote, bank deposit, drug dealing, all those proceeds were going to bank with BDA. So what happened was once U.S. Treasury designated BDA as a rogue bank, so to speak, what happened? It didn't impose anything. It didn't freeze any assets. The bank itself got really scared. So it reported, basically voluntarily froze those accounts and gave control over to the Macau Central Bank Authority. And then what that means, they use the expression, you kill a chicken to warn the monkeys. So basically to show an example, if you do something like this, you will be subject, you will be excluded from USA financial system. That was the effectiveness of the BDA. That was 2005, September, but at the same time, Treasury Department and U.S. State Department were going in parallel tracks in terms of going after North Korea, but with different agenda. U.S. State Department wanted to have six-party talk going. And there was a lot of tension with Chris Hill, at the time Assistant Secretary, former U.S. Ambassador to Korea, as you know, because he wanted to have success on the six-party talk front, whereas the Treasury wanted to really make BDA as a good example. So long story short, after about almost a year of negotiation between the agencies and negotiation with China and Macau, had to release those $25 million funds from BDA to China and ultimately to North Korea. And that was September 2006, around then. And then the six-party talk broke down in basically in short order. And October 9th of 2006, soon thereafter, there was the first nuclear test. So that is the challenge we're facing. You know, even within the same government, Treasury and State, they all have sort of different ways of looking at problems, and then different consequences. And BDA case Section 311 is a very powerful tool. So I'm actually hopeful that'll be more precise in terms of targeting the sort of a money flow as opposed to UN sanctions. So my long answer to your question, yes, it is very significant potentially.
Well, the unilateral sanctions also include the secondary boycott that you mentioned, which might be effective in persuading Chinese companies to reduce trade with North Korea.
The BDA case was, in a way, similar to secondary sanctions, because banks got scared, because for banks, reputation is very important. And what the United States is saying right now is that if you are doing business with North Korea, you cannot do business with us. The U.S. finance minister made it clear that they have to make choice. For banks, if they cannot do business with the United States, they are not global banks. So they stop being a global bank. So that's a very serious issue, and that's why U.S. unilateral sanctions, in some ways, will be more effective than UN sanctions.
In the meantime, there is a war of words going on between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Tensions are quite high around the Korean Peninsula. Is there anything the international community can do at a time like this?
Actually, these are very dangerous. I mean, exchanges over those words, because wars in history, wars have not broken out because they are intended. A lot of times, wars break out because of escalation, because of accidents. So that's why we are at a very dangerous situation. We should admit it, and we should take every caution that these kind of accidental escalation be avoided. But I think all the players right now, they understand the stakes involved. So even though they use some rhetorics, I think eventually we will be able to deal with this issue with this issue diplomatically, diplomatically, including using sanctions and pressure.
What kind of challenges do you see ahead of us?
Yeah, before I get to that, if I want to add one comment on the BDA type of U.S. unilateral action, I think the real question is whether U.S. will be, I don't know, for lack of a better word, bold enough to really potentially target Chinese banks directly, similar to BDA. That'll be a big political step for the U.S., because that might really provoke China into sort of unexpected hostility towards U.S. actions. So that's a little tricky. But as Ambassador Oh mentioned, it could be a very powerful tool. On the what the world community can do, I'm a little disappointed that the rest of the world, other than the basically directly related parties of so-called six parties, are not voicing enough concern publicly, other than a few moments of rhetoric at the UN Assembly. Because at the end of the day, if something really disastrous happened because of some trigger from North Korea, it will be a disaster for the humanity. And that should be realized by the international community. And every national leader all around the world should really call North Korea out.
But more and more countries are expelling North Korean diplomats.
Yes, so they should do, that is a very good sign, which hasn't happened before. So I think more of that should happen, not just in action, but also in rhetoric, literally, philosophically, politically isolating them, because that's really, really important in addition to exerting economic pressure. So that's, I think, what could be done by international community. In terms of what can be done legally, institutionally through UN and others, those are being done, so we'll have to see.
Well, with North Korea continuing to defy the international community, there doesn't seem to be a quick solution in sight for now. We have little choice but to wait and see whether these sanctions can make a difference. Well, thank you very much, Professor Oh and Mr. Kim, for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's all for this week, Upfront. We'll be back next week. Thanks for watching.